This is 20 Minutes of Impact from the United States Energy Association Power Sector Podcast. I'm Herman K. Trabish. I've covered the power sector since 2006, and I currently report for Utility Dive. In this episode of the podcast series on virtual power plants, or VPPs, my guest is Seth Frader-Thompson, president of Grid Edge software platform developer EnergyHub. Seth's going to talk about the Huels Test and the standards and language it uses to describe how VPPs compare in performance to conventional power plants. Seth's first leadership positions were with smart consumer device pioneer Honeybee Robotics in engineering, technology development, and business development. He became president of EnergyHub in 2007 and has ever since been driving the growth and utility integration of distributed energy resources, DER, which of course are the components of virtual power plants. Seth, in your time with EnergyHub, DER started as a pretty much minor and not very well trusted source of demand response. Your paper calls that VPP maturity levels 0 and 1. But DER are now components of limited but increasingly reliable maturity level 2 VPPs. So briefly, take us on that journey to introduce us to this whole subject. Take us on that journey from demand response to VPP.
Yeah, thanks, Herman. Excited to talk about this very nerdy topic.
Yeah.
Before I get into that journey, I want to make a quick correction just on my background at Honeybee.
Okay.
Um, uh, Honeybee Robotics was still is a firm that's sort of in the aerospace and robotics world and does the most fascinating thing, which is exploring the subsurface of like other planets. And so my background before I started doing this nerdy thing was a different nerdy thing, which was
Ah,
grinding rocks on the surface of Mars and developing pieces of small satellites. So anyway, that's what Honeybee did. Uh, to talk
that
about
prepared Steph. I got to say that undoubtedly prepared you. Grinding rocks undoubtedly prepared you for getting utilities to recognize DER.
there's definitely a joke in there somewhere. People always say like, "Oh, long sales cycles and they're so slow." It's like, have you tried the federal government? Okay,
Go
so
ahead.
so demand response in that journey. So I think it's kind of interesting to talk about that especially in the context of the Huels test. So where demand response was before Energy Hub and kind of companies of our era was utilities in certain parts of the country had actually gotten pretty good at putting devices in people's homes. Sometimes they were sort of like first generation semi-smart thermostats. Sometimes they were a load switch that sort of existed. It would interrupt the signal from your old dumb thermostat to your HVAC. And in those cases, it delivered the result, right? Like utilities, I think at the time, Florida Power and Light, Baltimore Gas and Electric, Duke Energy, a variety of other utilities, DTE, had done hundreds of thousands, maybe even close to 1 million homes where they had the ability to shed load. And that had the ability to offset a peaker plant, or it had you could use it as an emergency resource in the case of a power plant failure or something like that. What they didn't do, though, was really replicate the functionality of a power plant. And so Energy Hub came along. We did some other things before we sort of settled on this business. And we sort of rode this wave of people buying internet connected devices, which had the key differentiator was that they were two-way. So instead of these original devices where you sort of sent out a pager signal, it was one way. Devices would hear it and they would interfere with the control of your air conditioning system. Now we had the ability to send subtle controls. We could say, raise the temperature in this home by 1 degree and do it for exactly this time. And then we could get data back from the device to see, okay, how did we change the operation of that device? And so
Mhm.
that was kind of step one, and that gets to the visibility aspect of passing the Huels test. Um, and then we started to do that at scale, and doing it at scale allowed us to say, all right, there are millions of homes that have or will have these DERs. They're all internet connected, and this gives us the ability to upset the economics. Instead of the utility having to go out and install equipment in the customer's home, which is expensive, slow, kind of puts you on the hook for like any problem that might come up with the customer's HVAC. Now we're basically just going to a customer who has a device and saying, "Do you mind signing up for this thing? It's an opportunity for you to be part of the solution here. You can help your community become more resilient. You can help save money for the community, and we will pay you to do that." And so that is kind of where this journey started. Where this gets us eventually is when you aggregate all of that data and all of that control into something that's, a powerful piece of software. It allows you to do something that is far more visible, far more forecastable, controllable, schedulable, and turn it into something that really it does a much better job of kind of replicating the functionality of a power plant.
Interesting. Yeah, and that two-way communication also, you mentioned an interesting word, the subtle changes. Um, that was a key and remains a key factor in getting customers to be willing to participate in VPPs, right? Because you can tell them, look, you're not even going to notice the changes that we manage for you.
That's right. Yeah, I mean, what this gets to, I think for us, the holy grail is everybody says, yeah, we're happy to participate because why not? Like it really,
Yeah.
I mean, it's just easy and it's like the least I can do. And I'm hearing all this stuff in the news about how there's not enough power to power all these data centers, or we want to decarbonize, or whatever the reason is. It's just an easy step that every customer can do, and they can do it across all of their devices. They can do it with their HVAC system, with their battery, with their electric vehicle, et cetera.
Water heater, et cetera. Yeah. Okay, let's talk about the Huels test. You put this forward in a recent white paper. It's like Alan Turing's test that compares machine intelligence and human intelligence. And by the way, for anybody that wants to know, it's not some play on fuels. It's named after EnergyHub computer engineer Matthias Huels. Its purpose is to identify how a virtual power plant compares in performance to a conventional power plant. So tell us about the Huels test, and especially about its VPP maturity levels 2, 3, and 4. And let's find out which of those levels does VPP performance match or maybe even surpass other power plants in system services. Tell us about that.
Yeah, so like you said, this started with this thought experiment of, okay, the Turing test says, if you're in a conversation via text with a computer, can you tell the difference? But can you fool a human operator and they don't know they're talking to a person or a computer? And so Matthias started with this thought experiment. Could we unplug a real power plant and replace it with a virtual power plant, and the grid doesn't notice or a grid operator doesn't notice? Um, if you sort of think about like where this came from, the very first VPP control software literally had nothing to look at. There was no graph. You'd click a button and it would say, okay, like starting demand response events. And then there was just nothing to see. And utilities would have to go out and gather data remotely in the field to sort of prove that it worked. Now, like we said in earlier in the conversation, you now have all this data coming back. So we want to say, all right, it's one thing to go from you have control but no data to you have control but data. Do you now have the ability to do better control? So one of the complaints about early VPPs was that you would send a signal out to a bunch of smart thermostats, for example, but they wouldn't necessarily in aggregate lead to a load shape that would really replicate a virtual power plant. So one of the first things we started to do was say, can we shape the aggregate load here so that if you look at it in terms of the output of a virtual power plant, it looks like sort of a square wave of go to 100 megawatts, output that for 4 hours, then ramp back to zero. So so the VPP maturity framework attempts to take each of these dimensions and sort of quantify them in a way that kind of just gives us a common framework where we can all agree on what does it take. And so the basic elements of that are what data do I have to show that it is working? What data do I have that allows me to forecast in advance what the output of this virtual power plant is going to be? Can I shape this in a way that says, all right, I'm going to give you a set point for the first 15 minutes, then the next 30 minutes, then hour 3, et cetera. And so it quantifies all of those things. we chose to say that you pass the Huels test at level 3, where a human operator has enough capability out of the VPP that they say, yeah, this is pretty much the same as a conventional power plant. I want to say two things here. One, when you go to level 4, you're going beyond what a conventional power plant can do because now you're helping to support the distribution grid. But a critical thing here is no one should take away from this that you have to be at level 3 to offset or eliminate a peaker plant, for example. You can be absolutely at level 2 and successfully offsetting the need to run or build conventional power plants. That could be a peaker plant, that can be a mid-peak. There's a bunch of different kind of grid services products that they can do functionally. The
Right,
difference here
right.
is that the framework essentially builds this to the point where you've removed all excuses for why you should not use a VPP. It's gotten to parity on every dimension. And at the core of that, we think it's really trust. It's really like, do I know what this thing is going to do? Do I believe it will do what I command it to do? And can I watch it in real time and verify that it's actually working?
Okay. Now let me ask you a couple questions, Seth. First of all, uh, level 2 can, we saw this in California last summer, dramatically impact peak demand. That was a DSGS. That's just those are that's just a um, aggregation of solar and storage mostly. That's kind of level 2, isn't it? Am I right about that? Correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you could say that that aggregation was probably close to level 3.
Uh,
I think we had. I think there was a lot of technology involved there that was giving closed loop load shape. So it was like hold a specific output for a specific amount of time. It was reasonably well integrated into the market. I think there are some important details about how that could be improved, but I'm not sure how many of those details are related to sort of the capabilities of the VPP or the way the system is built to incorporate VPPs. Core to our kind of hypothesis here is that this is not like passing the Huels test is not something that any one entity can do on its own. This needs to be part of an integrated system, and it's pretty interesting when you look at how this stuff gets integrated into wholesale markets. There are a whole bunch of implementation details that make it unnecessarily difficult for a VPP that is capable of operating at level 3 to actually be integrated into the market or integrated into the utility system in a way that actually achieves that.
okay. Now, let me just clarify. We're going to get to all those things that you just mentioned in a little more detail, but let me just ask you this. I, and correct me if I'm wrong, again, please. I sort of think about these levels as how many system services can the VPP provide? For instance, that DSGS experiment last summer that came up with 500 and something megawatts for peak demand, maybe it couldn't provide ancillary services, or maybe it couldn't be relied on as energy because it only met that 2 hour window situation. Is that a useful way to think about these levels? Is how completely system services can be met? Or is that
It's
completely wrong-minded?
no, I would say it's right, but it's how do I want to say this? So to your point about grid services, right? There are some basic sort of things here of is this thing available with day ahead notice, or is it available with 5 minutes notice, or is this thing adjusting itself every 2 or 3 seconds? So to some extent, yes, as you go to the right in the maturity framework, you do unlock. You go from kind of capacity
Ancillary
non-spin to
services.
spinning,
Yeah.
and you do pick up some of those ancillary services. Um, but that's not the entire story because you're unlocking the distribution protection. But I would say that let's even if you were just saying, all right, I just need in California you'd call it resource adequacy, or I just need I need capacity on the network. You don't need to have unlocked the ancillary services to have unlocked a much higher value from the resource. One of the fundamental, um, I guess, strengths and weaknesses of VPPs is that the business case for demand response was something that existed that companies like EnergyHub benefit from, which essentially starts from the notion of a power plant and then kind of derates it to something that is less capable than a power plant. The good news is that's a revenue stream that people can plan around. The bad news is it is based on an assumption that it is less functional than a power plant. And so as it gets more functional, it needs to be treated as more functional. It needs to be incorporated into the planning stack, whether it's for the market or for a utility, in a way that's kind of more mainstream. It needs to be paid as though it's a more functional power plant, et cetera. So we need to make sure that we're not saying, all right, we built this thing on this like heavily discounted model of a power plant, and we're just going to make it endlessly more capable, but not get any credit for it.
Here's a quick note from the sponsor of our series of podcasts about virtual power plants, EnergyHub. What if everyday devices had the potential to strengthen the grid when it's needed most? EnergyHub helps utilities turn that potential into dependable capacity by coordinating thermostats, EVs, batteries, and other devices so they work together as virtual power plants, or VPPs, that respond to grid needs in near real time. EnergyHub's latest white paper lays out a maturity model for VPPs that can be planned and dispatched with the same confidence as conventional plants while being 40 to 60% less expensive to build. That's why more than 160 utilities across North America partner with EnergyHub to manage over 2.5 million devices that provide 3.4 gigawatts of flexible capacity. Read the white paper and discover what VPPs can do for your grid at energyhub.com. Well, so let's dig a little deeper on what it means to get credit. Um, the paper has it names three pillars that a VPP has to achieve to match or even better conventional power plant performance. It names visibility, schedulability, and availability. Tell me about those pillars. It seems to me that what you have said is that there are limits on those things that keep today's VPPs mostly to level two.
Yeah.
But
So
there are things. Go ahead.
visibility it kind of covers, I would say, two main things, which is how well can you forecast it, and then how well can you track it and measure it. And so forecasting is, this is essential to the running of anything about the grid, right? There's just you're forecasting what's going to happen to conditions on the grid based on weather, based on time of day, based on seasonality, et cetera. So you need to have something that, again, this comes down to, does the operator know what they're going to get when they kind of push the button when they
Right.
call for this thing?
Right.
Schedulability is kind of comes down to, can I say I want this at this particular time, and can I give it a series of set points? So that can be really, really simple, like go from off to on, which is not really how it should work. Or it can be, all right, this is a 500 megawatt resource. I want to ramp it from, you know, 0 to 50 to 100 up to 500, and then I want it to do this, and then I want it to ramp down. Um, it just gets to the fundamental. Uh, I guess in a way you can think of this as a mental model. Many people will have said to me that they kind of think of power plants as just there's a big knob, right? You can turn the power plant up and down, and you have some limits to it, but it's kind of like revving the engine on your car. They want a VPP to work in the same way, and so the question is like, does it have a knob that you can operate?
Right.
Um, and then availability is the last piece, and then it's just literally how often can I use this, and are there constraints around this? And so if you look at a fleet of batteries, that would be kind of an ideal availability scenario in the sense that unless those batteries are scheduled to be doing something else, which is in the control of whoever owns the batteries, they are available anytime you want. And you can determine, am I going to dispatch these over a 4-hour window or am I going to dispatch them over a 12-hour window? And you can work out for yourself essentially, how do I pre-position the battery charge in aggregate so that I get the shape I want? And so if I were to sort of rate these things, batteries would be the highest availability, the sort of highest schedulability, generally the most visible. And then kind of go down a little bit, you'd say controlling HVAC is a little bit less available because HVAC, it tends to be available when you need it, but it's not available literally anytime. And so air conditioning is there when it's hot, but not when it's cold. Heat is there when it's cold, but not when it's warm, et cetera. And so it tends to be okay. You're not gonna, you're not gonna, you don't have air conditioning availability as a VPP for April or for October. And so that just needs to get planned into sort of how you value these resources based on what the needs of the grid are. Again, they tend to line up with when the grid needs capacity. And then electric vehicles are a completely different story where it's very much based on when are they plugged in and when are they not. And so I like to think of those three as sort of the best illustrations of different types of DER-backed VPPs. What's great about VPPs, though, is that you can build aggregate VPPs that are a mix of all of those things. And when you
Right.
put them
The
together,
value,
you tend to get something that's sort of 24/7, 365.
right. The value of diversity is key to the real value of VPPs, isn't it?
That's right.
Yeah. So let me go one more question here, Seth. You said that DSGS, the experiment in California that met peak demand one day last summer, over 500 megawatts, almost got to level three. I think you said because it included not just solar and storage, but controls, various controls and communications that allowed that to happen. Um, Again, correct me if I'm wrong. Now, having more of that presumably gets you to level three. And level four, I think you've said, really surpasses the performance of conventional plants. But there are things that have to happen, regulations, technologies, communications devices, deployment that require regulators, utilities, software providers, DER vendors to cooperate to develop to get to level four. Tell us a little bit about what they need to do, what those groups need to do, to what they need to develop, and what level four will do that surpasses conventional plants.
Yeah, so I don't want to go too deep on the DSGS example. One, because
Yeah.
it's not truly my area of expertise, but also because it's California, and so there's California has a unique way of making everything about virtual power plants unnecessarily complicated. And so you're like, well, why did it work that way? And then you have to kind of go back 20 years to figure out sort of 5 different things that interacted. So yeah, let's just talk about in general what are the requirements. So the
Sure.
number one thing is around kind of keeping this simple. There is a huge amount of capability that exists today that is literally just about implementation and business case. So so for example, you mentioned level four. I think that's the right way to anchor this. So think of level four as being if a power plant were not just centrally connected to transmission and then kind of, distributed in big drops. If you had 1 million power lines running out from the power plant and going directly to all these houses, a virtual power plant has the ability, because it is made up of all these DERs, it can both support the bulk system at the transmission and generation level, and because it is connected to distribution, it has the ability to solve problems on the distribution network. And so an
Protect
example would
meters
be,
and protect substations, right?
right, so you have some local congestion. You say, all right, we're going to have to upgrade the substation and we're going to have to reconductor this feeder. Well, actually, what if we just look at a forecast and you say, you know what, for 100 hours a year, this feeder is overloaded. You can use a virtual power plant to say, let's just eliminate that overload. Let's just prevent that from happening in the first place because you can shift the load around. The biggest problem in the industry today is not technology. It's around business model. Is no, to my knowledge, no utility has a proven business model that is, or sorry, an approved business model from their regulator of how they can do that at scale. We have some we have some enticing things happening. There's some interesting stuff happening in Excel Energy territory, for example, where there's a tariff that says that if you can provide distribution relief, we'll pay you a certain amount more. If you're an aggregator of DERs, you're a Tesla or a Sunrun, for example, we can bring you a certain amount of we'll pay more for distribution relief on top of what you can provide at the system-wide level. But nothing has really gotten to the point where every regulator is saying, okay, I see how they did that in that state. I'm going to copy and paste that. And so a lot of utilities are kind of waiting to see what is my business model? How do I get cost recovery on this? The utility has this obligation to make sure they can serve that congested feeder. If it really comes down to it and the planner is saying, all right, I got to decide whether I'm going to upgrade this feeder at a cost of millions of dollars or whether I'm going to rely on a VPP, there's uncertainty in the regulatory side. So that is the number one thing. Beyond that, I think everything else is kind of a systems integration problem. So um, uh, to try to like briefly illustrate the mental model here, let's just imagine a map of a neighborhood in the city, and you've got a bunch of houses or a bunch of businesses, and they've got batteries and thermostats and electric vehicles. The grid edge software at EnergyHub is aware of where each of those assets is. And then there's a piece of software that's running the distribution network that is aware of what the conditions of the distribution network are. Those two maps are overlaid with each other, but are they connected to each other? And the core of the sort of system integration challenge is to bring those things together so that the system that's watching the grid and controlling the grid can say to the DERM system, to use the acronym on EnergyHub, and say, okay, we need you to provide us load relief at this location at this time. And that is most of the problem in terms of the implementation.
Interesting. Well, it's that's a good place to leave it because clearly the Huels test both shows how virtual power plants today have really grown in sophistication and capabilities. And it also shows where virtual power plants need to go. And so I think that's a good place to close this one out. We're going to be talking a lot more about virtual power plants here on the USEA Power Sector Podcast in the coming weeks. So stay tuned. Right now, I want to thank my guest, EnergyHub President Seth Frader-Thompson, for describing the Huels test and the standards and language it uses to define what today's VPPs need to match the performance of conventional power plants and even surpass them. As always, I also want to thank our listeners for taking the time to check out the USEA Power Sector Podcast. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and share with everybody you know our quest for energy transition solutions.